A federal judge has challenged the scope of the special counsel's mandate. And when did the president know about that hush money payment to Stormy Daniels? Joining us now to discuss all this, former U.S. Attorney Joe DeGeneva, a key Trump supporter, and Lanny Davis has served as special counsel to President Clinton and has a new book out, The Unmaking of the President 2016. Gentlemen, welcome back.
Hi, Chris.
Good to be here.
Morning.
Let's start with Rudy Giuliani's statements this week. Joe, did they help or hurt the president's legal case?
Well, I think they're irrelevant. What matters here is that the payment was legal. It was for personal reasons, to protect the family, and I think discussion of it serves really no useful purpose in terms of the facts of it. But as far as I'm concerned, it's a nothing burger.
All right, we're going to get into that payment in a second, but I want to ask you, Lanny, because some Trump advisors fear that in all his comments this week about what the president knew and when, that Rudy Giuliani has waived his attorney-client privilege and that he could be asked about his discussions with Donald Trump in court. Are they right?
I think they are possibly right. He's a crisis manager by his own description, and he committed 3 cardinal violations of crisis management, which I also do. Number one is don't make matters worse for a client. And I think by what he has said on television, he's exposed President Trump to possible prosecution for 2 crimes. Secondly, I do believe he's waived attorney-client privilege to the extent that he mentioned conversations with the client. That's a waiver. And third, don't underestimate your adversary. I know Bob Mueller, and I know Ken Starr, and to paraphrase a famous expression, Bob Mueller is no Ken Starr. He's not holding press conferences with a cup of coffee every morning, and you're going to get a much different conduct pattern from Bob Mueller than you had from Ken Starr.
All right. One of the big issues, which we touched on at the beginning, is why Stormy Daniels was paid that hush money. Was it a campaign expenditure? And I think it's fair to say that Rudy Giuliani was on both sides of that issue this week. Take a look.
It wasn't for the campaign. Right. It was to save their not their marriage as much as their reputation. Imagine if that came out on October 15th, 2016, in the middle of the last debate with Hillary Clinton.
Joe, given the fact that this payment to Stormy Daniels was finalized 11 days before the election, isn't it hard to argue that this wasn't a campaign expenditure?
No, I don't think it is. In fact, the law on this is pretty clear that if it's a purely personal matter, which this clearly has to be, it doesn't matter what its relationship was to the timetable in a campaign. But let me just say as well to something Lanny said. A lawyer cannot waive the attorney-client privilege. Only the client can waive the attorney-client privilege. So whatever Rudy may have said, he didn't waive the attorney-client privilege for the President of the United States. But by that,
let me ask, is he right?
He's absolutely right. The client owns the privilege, but because Rudy Giuliani mentioned a conversation, he can be subpoenaed and forced to testify, and he's a fact witness and has to recuse himself. In fact, the only good news for Donald Trump is that by his words on television, I think Rudy Giuliani has to be replaced, because he's now going to be a fact witness and has to respond to a subpoena for what he said to the president on an issue of factual dispute as to what the motive was of the loan.
You think Rudy Giuliani already is going to have to be replaced?
I think that there's at least an argument that by speaking publicly about a conversation with the president, he becomes a fact witness on a crucial question. Was the personal loan that now President Trump admits that he gave to Michael Cohen and was reimbursing Michael Cohen, is the word that Rudy Giuliani used. That's a fact that needs to be questioned in front of a grand jury on the issue of whether it was a political contribution.
You think that's possible, that he...
I do not believe that Mr. Giuliani is going to get a subpoena from anybody, and if they do, I think it's another example of how this process is completely out of control. That is not to say that someone, a private lawyer representing a litigant, might not try to do that, but I think it will be remarkably unsuccessful.
I want to stay on this question of whether or not the payment to Stormy Daniels was a campaign expenditure to try to protect candidate Trump or a personal expenditure to try to protect Donald Trump from what he says in any case was a completely unfounded claim by Stormy Daniels. Prosecutors, Lanny, brought a similar case against John Edwards in 2012, saying that money that was spent to hide one of his affairs was a campaign expenditure. His defense argued no, it was a personal expenditure to hide an affair from his wife. The jury didn't buy the argument, and John Edwards walked. I mean, if it worked for John Edwards, why wouldn't that work for Donald Trump?
So the key word is jury. There is an indictment to determine fact disputes that juries have to decide. There could be two reasons. Rudy Giuliani stated one reason on Fox and Friends. He said, well, imagine if it happened during the debate and it would have hurt the campaign, and Michael Cohen did his job. That's one view. Another view is that it was about his marriage. That's up to a jury to decide, but I think my friend Joe would say there's enough probable cause on that fact dispute for there to be an indictment.
I don't know who would be indicted, but it wouldn't be the President of the United States at any rate. And the bottom line is that when there is a history of crisis management inside of a business like there was in the Trump enterprise, there was all sorts of crisis management going on. There were settlements all the time of various disputes involving businesses, financial transactions, and personal relationships. All of those are predate any campaign, and in fact, the allegations here are from 2006. So the notion that this is somehow related to the campaign requires an unbelievable stretch of prosecutorial authority.
Let's get off of all of that, and let's get to the central case, which is the special counsel's investigation of Donald Trump in terms of collusion, in terms of potential obstruction of justice. This week, a federal judge in Alexandria, Virginia, raised serious questions about whether the special counsel's case specifically against Paul Manafort falls outside the special counsel's mandate. I want to put this up on the screen. Federal Judge T.S. Ellis told prosecutors, you don't really care about Mr. Manafort's bank fraud. What you really care about is what information Mr. Manafort could give you that would reflect on Mr. Trump or lead to his prosecution or impeachment. Lanny, is it legitimate for the special counsel to go after Manafort in a case that's supposed to be about the election and actions after the election for what Manafort allegedly did back in 2005?
I don't know, but I have my doubts. I think Paul Manafort's attorneys have a point that there is a limit to what an independent counsel, in my case with Ken Starr, with President Clinton, and a special counsel, really the same issue. I don't know whether that line has been crossed. I certainly think there's a question to be raised about what bank fraud has to do with Russian collusion, and that's something that needs to be addressed by the court.
Joe, how damaging were the questions? And we should make it clear that Judge Ellis, while he raised the question, did not rule on the case and did not say he's going to throw out the Manafort indictment. How damaging was it to Special Counsel Mueller?
Judge Ellis did something very important on Friday. He started a national civics lesson about what the Constitution is about and about what the powers of a special counsel are. Judge Ellis may very well not dismiss the case, but he could also exclude from evidence anything seized in that outrageous raid of Paul Manafort's house at 3 o'clock in the morning, taking Mr. Manafort and his wife out of bed in their night clothes, handcuffing Mrs. Manafort. I mean, outrageous conduct in a case that is of absolutely no significance. Bob Mueller should be ashamed of himself to allow that to happen on his watch. The answer is the judge probably won't dismiss the case, but he may very well exclude all the evidence from that raid.
Okay. I want to get now to perhaps the central issue, which is whether or not the president is going to, after all of the back and forth, end up sitting for an interview with the special counsel. Here's what President Trump said this week about that.
I would love to speak. I would love to go. Nothing I want to do more because we did nothing wrong. If I thought it was fair, I would override my lawyers.
Joe, after all the negotiations are done, should the president sit for an interview with the special counsel's team, and if he refuses, can Mueller subpoena the president?
The president will not sit down for an interview because this investigation has now reached a level of bad faith. This is no longer a good faith investigation. The tactics, the in terrorem tactics that Mueller has used against Michael Cohen, against Manafort, demonstrate a lack of good faith. The president should not sit down because under the Constitution,
let's get to the second issue.
The president cannot be indicted. That's number one.
No, I'm asking whether he can be subpoenaed.
The answer is he cannot be subpoenaed. And the reason for that is because under Article 2, all executive power vests in the President of the United States. Mr. Mueller cannot subpoena the president because the only way a president can be held accountable for anything, whether it's allegedly criminal or not, is through impeachment.
Okay.
Impeachment, nothing else.
I want to bring Lanny in because there's never been a case exactly like this but doing a little bit of quick history lesson this week. Over the course of our history, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Nixon, and your client, Bill Clinton, have all been forced to submit to court orders. Can President Trump be subpoenaed to testify?
So first of all, Mr. Justice diGenova, who I've known for many years and have a great deal of respect for, I don't want to hurt his career, is just simply, we don't know what the Supreme Court will do, and it will ultimately be a Supreme Court question. Number two, President Clinton decided to accept voluntarily, so there was never a test of that, and President Nixon did resist a subpoena, but it was about documents, not testimony. So this is brand new. In my opinion, President Trump, as the president, as a political elected official representing all the American people, should not resist a subpoena, but should voluntarily do exactly what President Clinton did.
In the Paula Jones case, didn't the court rule that the president wasn't above the law and that he had to get involved in the Paula Jones civil suit?
Yes, and the answer is yes. He was forced to testify in a civil suit. We don't have a test of whether he can be subpoenaed, but in the language of Nixon versus the United States, there is language that goes beyond documentary production and testimonial production, that even in a criminal case, the president is, quote, not above the law. I think he will have to testify.
I've got about 1.5 minutes left. I want to get to one final question, and that is the question of credibility, because President Trump apparently misled the American people on Air Force One in April when he denied knowing anything about this payment to Stormy Daniels. Take a look. Joe, how damaging is that to President Trump and to his political support on this issue?
It's not damaging at all, because in fact the people realize that this part of the investigation is why the whole thing is off track. Under Article 2, and this relates to what Lanny was saying earlier, the reason Mueller wants to talk to the president is not to investigate a crime. It's to send a report to the Deputy Attorney General for impeachment. A use of a grand jury subpoena to get testimony from a president about the official act of firing the FBI director is unconstitutional, illegal, and the president should fight it all the way to the Supreme Court.
The president clearly misled the American people in what he said there.
No, he didn't.
Wait. He was asked, did you know anything about the payment? And he said, no, he did.
We do not know the full context of when the president learned everything about this. We have no idea. And first of all, that's on an airplane in the middle of an important trip.
Oh, there's an airplane exception?
No, but there's an exception to kind of goofy reporters' questions that get asked at specific times, and the president is entitled to make a mistake. Who knows what he knew or didn't know at that time?
Well, Lanny, you're not off the hook here either, because the president that you work for lied to the American people. Take a look.
I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
Fact was, you loved seeing that again. President Clinton was able to survive it, so will Donald Trump.
So look, we didn't have a lawyer contradicting a president and basically calling him a liar. Rudy Giuliani contradicted that statement and said that that's what the president told him.
But the facts contradicted Bill Clinton and the dress.
We certainly have an unusual situation where a lawyer contradicts the president, and then the president the next day says he doesn't know what he's talking about. This is unusual, and Mr. Justice diGenova may be right, but the Supreme Court, I think, is going to uphold Nixon versus the United States, that it applies to testimony. Mr. Trump's going to have to defy a grand jury subpoena, which is what we call a constitutional crisis.
Okay. He won't defy it. He's going to take it to the Supreme Court.
But if he loses,
that's not defiance.
If he loses, I think he will say that's the Supreme Court, as President Andrew Jackson once said, they issued the decision, let them enforce it.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you both. Thanks for your time. This was not only entertaining, I learned some stuff here, so let's have you back.
Thank you.
And we will continue to follow the twists and turns of this remarkable story. Up next, we'll bring in our Sunday group to discuss the fallout from Rudy